Welcome to In Plain English, a podcast where we discuss scientific research in terms that are accessible to everyone, not just the experts. I'm your host, Jamie Moffa. Before we get started, a few quick reminders. You can download the paper for each episode at inplainenglishpod.org by clicking on the episodes link in the main menu. We believe in open access science for all, so the papers we choose will always be free for you to download. If you have a question or comment about the previous article, you can submit it under the Continue the Conversation tab. If you are interested in being a guest or presenter for a future episode, you can click on the Become a Guest tab on the website. You can reach out to us on Facebook or Twitter at Plain English Sci and subscribe to our podcast on Spotify, Google Podcasts, or wherever you get your podcasts so you never miss an episode. With that out of the way, on to today's paper. So, hi everyone, welcome to the 7th episode of In Plain English. Today, we're going to be discussing the paper Reconsidering Domestication from a Process Archaeology Perspective by Bogard et al. With our guest, Grace Ward. Grace, would you like to introduce yourself?
Thanks, Jamie. So my name's Grace, and I'm a PhD student in WashU's Department of Anthropology. And specifically, I do kind of the archaeology of human, and by human, let me say like social, like society-wide interactions with the environment through time. Specifically, lately I've been working during a period of time called the Late Archaic, which is about 3,000 to 4,000 years ago. And I'm most interested in the dynamics of indigenous societies in the American Southeast.
Thanks, that sounds really cool. And joining Grace are our two non-expert guests, Caitlin Murphy and Marc Blanc. Caitlin and Marc, would you each like to introduce yourselves?
Yeah, sure. I'm Caitlin Murphy. I am a postdoc in the Department of Anesthesiology. I study pain and addiction, and it's a strong emphasis on non-expert.
And I am Marc Blanc. I am getting my doctorate in American literature at Washington University, and I study the printing and reprinting of African American literature in radical labor and socialist magazines at the turn of the 20th century, the moment of radical labor unrest through groups like the Wobblies and nascent organizations such as early socialist parties and things like that.
Great. Well, thank you all for being here. And without further ado, Grace, take it away.
Yeah, for sure. This paper is Bogard et al. Is like this big synthesis of a bunch of different archaeologists all around the world who study different aspects of the relationship between societies and environments and humans and other species, all getting together and just trying to like kind of reconfigure how archaeologists talk about domestication, and domestication being the thing where traditionally the definition is basically via like human intervention, other species change genetically and become a different species based on their interactions with people. So of course, we have the entire world of plants. Of most of the foods that we eat now are domesticated plants, things that have been through thousands of years of interactions with humans, shaped to be the kind of like foods that they are today. And the same with the animals. So from our like pets like dogs and cats up to animals that we use as like livestock. It may be important background and like a weird kind of thing is like, why are archaeologists so interested in domestication, like particularly? And archaeology, it's really like most simply the study of change through time. So how societies change through time. And domestication is really, really interesting because it's an evolutionary process. It's a way by which organisms, in fact, like biologically change through time. And with, again, this definition of the particular relationship or kinds of relationships that we like bundle under domestication, they're all about how human practices, different ideas of how to interact with the natural world, different ideas of what is, good to eat, what species are good to have as companions, what we want the physical world around us to look like. All of that is as like the social processes of like thought and dynamics within a society is being reflected and kind of like taken up by the actual like bodies and biologies of these other organisms. So it's almost like human history gets written into other species via domestication is one kind of way that it's been thought about, and that has made again, domestication is just like a really interesting thing for archaeologists going back into the 20th century, like the origins of agriculture question as being kind of like an aspect of looking at what happens once people start, mass producing domesticated plants and animals. It's been kind of like a key archaeological question. But so this paper and this whole kind of like project of lately archaeologists trying to reconfigure and reframe how we talk about domestication, it becomes like kind of like a philosophy of science question. And that's very much, this paper is fundamentally like, what if, like, let's change how we look at this question and where we look, and let's frame it by applying process philosophy, which I background don't know that much about, but was like a philosophical movement that like really affected the practice of like the scientific method. But anyways, it's basically just, if we take the tenets of process philosophy, by which things are thought about as like continuations of previous states, and apply that to domestication instead of kind of following what's been the kind of like more historical, or not historical, but like the more like traditional like approach by archaeologists, the question of domestication has been looking for like the moment of domestication or instances of domestication as if it's like a discrete process or like a discrete event. And the whole like application of the process philosophy is like, no, it's all about like the relationships and events leading up to and continuing like an actual point of change. That's how we look at change through time, is as accretional, and some kind of like methods and terms involved. So I think through here they talk about zooarchaeology, just meaning the specialty of archaeology by which people look at like animal bones and talk about people's relationships with animals via the bones. And then paleoethnobotany, which is actually what I do as a specialty, which is looking at the remains of plants at archaeological sites and drawing interpretations from there.
So Grace, you mentioned that the question of domestication becomes a philosophy of science question. How should we do our methods? What's the best way to treat these really questions that deal with history, like the longue durée of history?
Yes, longest durée. Yeah. Right. Yeah.
Right. And so that makes sense to me intellectually, but it also seems like the article, as much as the question of methodology and epistemology and ontology and all the other ologies, one of the main impetuses for writing this is the political motivation. They make a lot of mention about colonialism and anti-colonialism, and how sort of until process ontology, the major ideas of understandings of domestication come from the colonialist definition, which is human beings took agriculture and animals, imposed humanity onto them, and brought them into the fold. And then you get like these dichotomies of wild and domesticated and all that are just sort of second nature to most people now. I was wondering if you could give us like the political stakes of this, why does this matter? Why does it matter politically to rethink domestication as a long process, and also a process that is not just one party imposing itself onto the animals and plants and microbes and all those?
Yeah. Perfect. No, this is right. That is the core thing. And it's the world, like the practice of history, the practice of archaeology, anthropology is of course conditioned and situated within institutions that mostly derived from kind of the world created post European colonization in its like many forms, right? What's really interesting about something like archaeology is then like those exact kind of like strictures and like the dichotomies that we associate with different forms of like Western philosophy, we then backcast and we say like, this is how it's always been. People have always, in all societies, all times, had this like nature culture divide, or like a definite like male female divide, or a definite, just name your kind of like binary by which we kind of like the shorthands that we use within like literal like past couple of centuries of like capitalist like global society, backcasting those ideas through all of time, which is nuts because people have been around, like anatomically modern humans, for like 1.5 million years or something. And so the idea that in fact, the kind of thing is, if we change how we think about the relationship between people and environments, the potentials for different, like radically different ways of like actually understanding the world, it opens up the potential that like human beings actually have the ability to organize themselves socially in a manner that's different from how we've organized ourselves, different from like kind of like the world system we're all familiar with now, that there have been like lots of other ways that people have done things socially. And this means that this means in terms of like hierarchies, in terms of gender dynamics, multiple other facets of what we think of as like society. But it also, of course, means in terms of our relationship to what we could call the natural world, or our relationship to other species. So anyways, like the idea that like what's happening, and like the idea that like the base level expected relationship between people and an environment and people and other species is one in which people are imposing a preconceived will upon nature, upon other creatures. That's particular to like industrial society of the last little bit. And that also equals like a particular like way of looking in the archaeological record for instances of domestication, for looking for instances of like people, going out and seeing like a little weed growing and being like, we are going to make that into like maize. We are going to domesticate it. It's going to become corn. We know what we're doing. But this is saying like, no, actually the beyond just like the moral imperative of not assuming hierarchical relationships as being default to who people are, fundamentally. It's just also the archaeological record pushes against. And that's part of what's coming out in this article, and why it's really interesting is the synthesis is just all these case studies from around the world, where this idea that there's like a thing that people go and do to other beings that then is like the domestication moment doesn't match what in fact seems to be an entire world of like all kinds of different relationships. So like very slow form, like commensal relationships, like we can think about like with like cat domestication or something, where it seems like really like cats just started like coming to hang out around like human settlements, and then like they stuck around, and there's backing and forthing over like thousands of years. And the same with most of our main like domesticated crops too. These processes are extremely long and are all about like subtle, like historically contingent interactions between people and other species. And so that the political implications are, of course, it is not absolutely ordained within any form of like human nature that we shall dominate. That's not true. We see that through time, going way back. No, that's not what the archaeological record shows. The next step implications of like, what does this knowledge mean for how we like build a world going forward, which would be the big, really interesting question.
Okay, so what does it mean if you mentioned that if this narrative kind of persists, or is like the narrative that comes out in popular culture in the way that we behave with each other as non-archaeologists, for example, like humans tend to like impose power structures on whomever or whatever organism. What does it mean that even if that isn't true, if that narrative has come out of the woodwork, is there some kind of like chicken or egg philosophy or like self-fulfilling prophecy that can like happen from that?
How did it happen? Yeah.
Does that make sense? That's like a weird way to ask it, but like if the record says that that's not true, but we've learned somehow that it is.
We know that now we're in a very hierarchical society, right?
Right.
Like,
yeah.
So
what does that mean going forward then?
To that question. So there's this book that just came out that's like blowing archaeologists' minds right now. It's called The Dawn of Everything. And it's this collaboration between this anthropologist, David Graeber, who also had like a really storied like political history. He's recently passed away. And then an archaeologist named David Wengrow, who his specialty is basically like the early history of what we would consider like the Egyptian states. So a guy who spent a lot of time thinking about like civilization, state formation, how do people organize themselves in these like really like complex political entities. So anyways, they write this book, The Dawn of Everything, right? And it's kind of comparable to this article. It's a synthesis of a bunch of new data that are out and about, like derived through the archaeology of the last couple of decades. Because archaeology, like lots of other sciences, is kind of like techno-determined in a big way. So like as like our tools have become more and more refined, like our analytical tools, we're able to like talk on like smaller scales of time. We're able to kind of like figure out a lot more like nuance about how people actually like lived in the past. The premise of this book is exactly like taking like, okay, from all of this new like really like high resolution archaeological data, we know stuff like what this article is saying. Like we know that like processes of like domestication like took a long time. We know not everybody domesticated plants and animals. Like we have like all kinds of examples of these huge societies where they were continuing to, just utilize wild foods. Like we know that, the earliest cities aren't necessarily hierarchical. We know that people seem to have shifted social forms, going from what we could think of as like more complex, or just like, to go to the city example, like larger like cities type political structures, and could then from there shift and like disperse and like live as like smaller hunter-gatherer groups for centuries afterwards. Like what's going on? Then like couching it within exactly like your question, which is the perfect question, which is like, okay, cool. So if like we have all this information about how people have lived in all these awesome ways through time, like what's wrong with us? Because we all know like we live in this rigid hierarchy, and we're told like pretty a priori that this is the only way that it can be, that we can only live in the kind of like capitalist, like hierarchical configuration that is here, because we have this theory there's like the popular theory of history that wherever you are, that we are at somehow like a pinnacle of development at which like all events were leading to this point, and it had to, that there was some kind of like predestination of an ideal social form, and somehow it's capitalism. But so what they do with the book is they call this getting stuck. They call basically what we would think of as the past couple centuries of capitalism, i.e. like of like a social political system that is about the accumulation, that like values the accumulation of material wealth as like a fundamental like social good, and that uses like money as like a kind of like fundamental means of like mediating people's social relationships, and that like has situations in which we have people who own the ability to make things like the means of production, and they then oppress and like draw from the labor of everybody else. That particular social configuration in this book, Graeber Wengro refer to as getting stuck, that somehow in that process and leading up to it, and they don't place it right. So this is like, now I'm like in the weeds, like they don't place it like right necessarily at like the origins of capitalism, but like that's the lead up, the social structures and hierarchies that like surround, that precede and like continue through capitalism. That's kind of what they start talking about, that again gets to your question. Like, so how is it that we got into this position where the hierarchy where we live so hierarchically, where just about everybody in the world has now been brought under this system, and where we have, like via religion and other like lines of philosophy, including aspects of like the Enlightenment, social evolution that come out of like different aspects of European thought, that we like, how is it that we've like fixed ourselves into one social form when we know that through time people were much more flexible, people lived in different sizes of societies, they changed things all the time? And they don't really answer the question of how it is that we got stuck, but we know that we're stuck. Like, and that as a salient point, this is like the big head scratcher. If we know that, we have the ability to live in a way that doesn't, exploit and overexploit other species and the earth. We know that we have the ability to live in ways that allows for more like distributed power. Like, why does it seem so hard right now to like build anything else? And I guess that becomes like a historical question outside of like my range. They kind of leave it, a little bit hands off, because again, you got to get into the then history of exactly what happens around the origins of capitalism and then colonialism, like socially. There's like a little bit of a contradiction or like tension in this emphasis on like the incredible like social creativity of people in the past, when it's counterposed, and necessarily, right? Because like also like the reason that we talk about it all excitedly is being like, it's so cool that people could do all these different social forms in the past, that people, like had these like non-domineering relationships with like plants and animals, and had like different forms of like religion and etc. Is like, that is exciting only because we recognize kind of like the restricted or like the strictures of exactly like our ideological and social and political world now. The whole premise exists exactly because, right, we're like, why are we stuck in hierarchy?
I'm gonna like rehash really briefly and ineloquently like what you just said. It sounds like the nature of our current situation kind of like breeds the fact that we're unable to see or see as possible or find interesting, all of these other kind of, regardless of how we got here, these other social systems, just because the nature of our system right now kind of precludes that vision or like that understanding.
Totally. And then that's like, right, like the philosophy of science point of just like, so then how do we attempt to see?
One of my favorite parts of it was this part about the dog.
Oh my God, the dog part.
I was obsessed. Like, I'm kind of obsessed with it. And it honestly, it gave this, like, I was having a hard time with this part. So this part that I'm talking about, says the heading is processes versus things, and kind of like saying that rather than seeing things as like nouns and like objects, like they exist, that instead we should think of things as like processes because they exist through time. And I was like, how can a noun be a verb? And this analogy basically says that your dog existed yesterday and exists today and will exist tomorrow, hopefully, and that we can acknowledge that those are like two different temporal parts of the same dog, just like how the dog's head and the dog's tail are part of the same dog, but they're not the same thing. They're two distinct parts of the dog, just as yesterday, today, and tomorrow might be temporal features of the dog. And I was like, that is, not only do I love dogs, but that's a really great analogy.
No, totally. The end line of that, like, of the quotation of like, because they're quoting somebody else's like dog analogy, right, is right, so organisms are temporally as well as spatially differentiated. And it's just like, it's one of those really cool, like, let's like strange the idea that like that time doesn't function the same way as space, but like in terms of differentiation, it does, right?
Yeah. So what is that like? Why is it so important? And the paper really kind of digs this apart, but why is it so important that we see things as processes?
Because we're interested in how things came to be, you know, and everything like has to be something before and has to be something after, and it must change. And that's another point that comes out of this process philosophy. And also this whole line of biology, the idea that like the onus of explanation is on stability over change. And that's an idea that we get out of evolutionary biology. And it's also an idea that we get out of good history and out of materialist history, because there's also a link here to materialist approaches to history, including stuff like Marxism. A thing in the present is a thing in the present only if you're only interested in what it is like in the present. But if exactly you're trying to like situate all the pieces of how things have moved, how different things have, you know, like how things have changed, because it's, you know, like we recognize like socially and like physically the world has changed, right? So that means that everything has to be somehow involved in that change. And as such, with like using the dog analogy, taking like the thingness and instead thinking about it through time as something that the stages of it are actually the more like historically interesting thing than any kind of like end product or given like, you know, frozen moment. But those are the things that will help us understand why it is that things change or how they change or why they change.
It is a lot easier to address this whole power kind of idea if you're not seeing things as things, like if you see them as like non-static.
Yeah, and then also no power is absolute, right?
Yeah, it's just like a modern form of like the divine right of kings. It's like, oh, this is natural. It seems like a good time to ask about Marx. I'll take us to a passage on 65. Although the focus on individual aggrandizers, quote, and rare foods has diminished in importance in recent years due to the lack of supporting archaeological evidence, competition continues to play a pivotal role in models that place early agricultural intensification and domestication primarily in the context of competitive feasts and/or emerging private property. So this is the narrative that the process ontology is sort of working against. Like,
yes,
you know, like domestication is not inherently based on competition and private property and the acquisition of goods.
Not just because we like that argument morally, but because that's just true. Like in the archaeological record, there's no signs of anything like aggrandize, like as in like accumulation of things for the sake of just accumulating them and then like showing off to your neighbors. It's like, it's incredibly rare. You see like all kinds of social processes. That's one that does not actually occur much until lately.
I think it is important, Grace, to like stress that it's not like, yeah, a lot of us do have our own political and ideological stances, but also it's like, we're not just taking this data to suit our own purposes. Like this is, and that's kind of
just like, as far as like going through like the list of authors, you've got a lot of people who are like just these are, some I don't know, right, everybody, but like these are not like ideologues for the most part. Like these are people who just are like archaeologists who've just been studying stuff for some of them for a very long time in a really close manner, and have just like reached this conclusion of like, no, this process thing is how this works.
But okay, so Marx has an idea of primitive accumulation. I've heard of that, but I'm not quite sure I know what it is or how it might fit into this private property thesis.
So I'm going to say what I'm pretty sure it is, and then Caitlin, please correct. But like the primitive accumulation is about basically like a factor in setting the conditions for capitalism to emerge in Europe. And basically like this idea that like the primitive accumulation, i.e. what happens when Europe via whatever bizarre, historical contingent moments is able to go out and extract resources from other parts of the world, the Americas, that the surplus generated through that era of extraction sets the basis for like the kind of like juggernaut of like accumulation, and like that area becoming like a seat of capitalism.
And then that leads us to the quote moment of private property.
Yeah, so this is like a point that particular to this article and a little bit to Marx, but also like in terms of more particular to like really anthropologists who have been influenced by Marx, because what Marx did writing in like in the 1800s and using what anthropological and ethnological data was available, he was really interested in this question of like how did capitalism come to be? Like obviously his greatest contribution was describing how capitalism works in a really particular, like clear way. But he was really interested in the whole, like, how did it happen question too. But he was working with the data available at the time, which was pretty limited just because like a lot of archaeology hadn't been done, et cetera, et cetera. But so this question of like, when does private property emerge is huge and is like another one of those key, like I think about it in terms of my work, it's another key archaeological question kind of. And so, right. So like Marx, he has like ideas about like how it is that people came to create money or to create private property. And they're mostly kind of like speculative. But what we can do here and what's being referred to and like negated is the idea that private property, like in terms of like private property and the idea of like individuals owning things to like the absolute degree that, people have like final say in what happens to those things, that's something that like we don't see signs of in the archaeological record, and definitely not in the context of like domestication in plants and animals and stuff. Exactly this like cooperative model. It's also, I would put in the term like communal, like a lot of what we see in terms of like food production systems through time is exactly like communal work and like shared resources around the production of food that nobody necessarily owns, because right, that would be capitalism. If somebody came to like own like the means by which people were producing food and then like forced everybody to work under them. That's only happened lately, very lately. Like that's not on the record.
There's a part in the article that was talking about, or kind of made the point that most of the rest of the article would be about domestication of living things. So to me, I was like, okay, well, that makes me have two questions. One about what does it mean? Can we domesticate? Is there kind of rhetoric around domesticating things that are not living? And it really briefly addresses that. And then also, what does this mean for humans and power structures around like ownership of humans, like other humans, right? Like there's a like really big historical kind of, there are a lot of problems, obviously, in history about how like people taking land, which is not inherently living, or people taking other people. And those seem separate, or like I can't reconcile those two ideas with this. Does that make sense?
Oh, it totally makes sense. It's really brilliant. I've actually never heard anybody do like the like, because like domestication and slavery, then are they somehow conceptually linked? And slavery's taken a million different forms beyond like the chattel slavery that we've associated with like the Middle East Passage and like American history. Like there's just so many ways through history and time and places that people have like otherwise taken other people. But yeah, so because it's like that question of like forms of like dominance or like forms of hierarchy. And yeah, to the first point about the domestication of things, like the way that it's used is specifically, it's particular to living, it's used particular to like living things because of like this co-processing. But then really interestingly, just actually earlier today, I came across this article. It was about the domestication of fire, like a term that's used in terms of when people are talking about very early human history. So like when people first learned to like use fire in a productive, like tool-like manner. That's one way it's used. This particular argument was actually about modern reindeer herders, indigenous reindeer herders.
They reference that in this
Sweden.
article, yeah.
Oh, really?
It is the top of 61. So it says the bottom of 60 says, given its origins, the term domestication tends to imply closely controlled management. There are rich ethnographic examples of alternative approaches in which people explicitly recognize reciprocal contributions and agency of other species, and their own agricultural purposes or practices serve the needs of these species. But it contrasts with Siberian reindeer perspectives and European industrial perspectives on human-animal domestication relationships. So I guess this isn't really about, this part is not where they're talking about the kind of like human or like organism, non-organism.
It's good, but it does get into like, and the reason that the reindeer herders up in like far northern Europe, they're like anthropological classics. There's certain groups of people through time currently and in the past that anthropologists just love because of like the kind of like weird things they do. And the reindeer herding example, anthropologists, archaeologists have really loved because it's exactly an example of like, these are not fully like these are typically like the reindeer herds are like wild animals, like morphologically, but they like live so closely within a human system. But people, part of that system is people maintain their wildness and like let them go for parts of the year, etc. No, right. And then the fire thing is just putting this, it would be like putting this like non-living agent, right? Like in the context of another form of control. So I think that for the way that if domestication is useful for me, I like to keep it just to like living things, because exactly that co-changing through time. Fire, we haven't changed how fire works, like we've applied it to different things, but we haven't changed.
So what about like if I take a stone out of a river and I make it into a tool, then I have in some way removed that from like what it would have been without me.
There's like lines of research, and I think it comes up in here, this question of something that we would call landscape domestication. So, or it also gets into this like question of like the Anthropocene. I don't know if you guys have like heard that term, but the idea that we're in this different geological epoch defined by the period of time in which people have been the main force driving like climate and like physical earth changes. And like both of those ideas are exactly within this like, okay, but like let's zoom back if we, kind of taking the ideas that came out of domestication, these ideas that like people are acting in ways that are changing the nature, like the biology in this case of other species, and that it's a slow accretional process through time that like changes, that affects how human societies work, and like slowly and in many ways unintentionally affects how natural systems work, how ecosystems work. That little kernel of idea can then be extended to say things like there was an article published in like Nature or Science, I can't remember which one, like within the past couple of years, and the tagline was it's a really funny one, like humans have shaped all of terrestrial Earth for the past 12,000 years. Like that was just like that, like with exactly this idea of if we start thinking in terms of like when people take a stone out of a river, it's going to change how the river flows. If a bunch of people do it for a period of time, it's going to change how it flows. The key example of where this idea of like landscape domestication has really been applied would be actually in Amazonia, where historically isn't like academically historically, like people have like conceptualized Amazonia as this place that is absolutely a wild environment right before European colonization, that yes, there's native people there, but they're in small groups not doing much. But then the archaeology of the past couple of decades, as far as like revisiting some historical, like ethno-historical sources, so reports of some of the first Europeans who were in the area, it proves that like it was actually, without it being like a grain state, without it being like a society based around like the farming of lots of like, grain crops or anything, we actually had like cities, incredibly complex social forms in the Amazon based in many, the people were using domesticated plants, but really drawing from like what could be called like domesticated forests, where you have like an entire ecology being shifted to just like benefit people, basically to just like grow, like Brazil nuts or acai or other plants that are like, that people are particularly like people like and use, and that just through slow, thousands of years of like selection of just those plants, in fact, the entire ecology changes in such a way that we can call actually a lot of the Amazon like an anthropogenic landscape. We can say that people, in fact, made the Amazon, not absolutely, but like that's, you know, like the line that's there.
That's wild. This is all very mind-blowing, because it seems like when people like Grace, I've heard you tell a lot of people what you study. I mean, I've heard a lot of other anthropologists talk about it, and sometimes it's kind of funny when you hear someone say like, oh yeah, I study like the cultivation of beans in Peru. It's like, okay, but then it's like, but then you read this and it's like, oh, the beans in Peru are actually the key to everything. Caitlin's question reminded me about non-living things. Reminded me of a question I had about agency. What does it mean for a thing to have agency? Because that seems to be, agency seems to be a big part of the moral and political stakes of the argument. And I'm going back, let's go back to that dog passage. If Woodger's dog is regarded as a thing or a combination of substances rather than a dynamic process, its persistence through time is taken for granted or explained as a subject to a lack of external forces causing change. That's great. You were saying about like its stability being taken for granted and sort of naturalized as something that always has been. If instead the dog is a dynamically stabilized process, this persistence demands explanation and leads to understanding of how and why the dog functions. In addition, by thinking of the dog as a thing and not a process, we will tend to misunderstand or even deny its agency. So what does it mean for a dog to have agency? Because like the article also quotes Darwin and how Darwin talks about like unconscious evolution. So like, is the dog conscious of this? Like, does agency necessitate conscious, or am I being hopelessly humanistic?
No.
Like, consciousness is sort of key to intent or agency.
So what's happening here, and this is another thing that's kind of situated within kind of the history of talking about how people and environments have changed together through time, is this idea, other models, like the models of domestication that were all about, you know, like somebody goes out into a field and decides they're going to make wheat one day, and then they shape the whole thing and they do it. And like wheat and all the other ecological processes just like subordinate themselves to the will of this like human who, you know, they're just like, they totally just go along with whatever's happening in the human's brain. This is counterposed to that kind of thinking. The question of agency, because I've really struggled with it actually as a concept, because there's like, I think there's a blending that happens of agency and like intention and design.
Yeah.
And like intention and agency are not the same thing, because like if I just think about my own life, and this is really how I've tried to come to like make sense of this. Like I do a lot of things agentially, like I choose to like pick up like a glass or whatever, but without like intention of a larger process necessarily. And without, you know, I'm acting within a world of processes that I don't determine. So like I do have always the ability to act, but it is surrounded and conditioned by what else is happening. So there's models of domestication that people now talk about that are not so much in here, because it's kind of like another, it would be like another school of thought where we can think about like plants somehow having agency in a way that in terms of like being able to accept or like reject human changes, or being able to, you know, like maintain their own relationships with other plants as like their primary kind of like coevolutionary relationships beyond the relationship with humans. So I like that, if you want to describe that as agency, those are real processes that we recognize like biologically. So that's pretty cool. If you want to paint it with agency, that's what some people do. The larger question of how this fits with like the question of intention, I think is something that it becomes more of a problem when you're thinking about long-term change through time. Because that's the other thing, is this is all about trying to get at how do things and why do things change through time? How did we get where we are now? Did we design it? Did it just happen? Is it a mixture of those things? And so now the question of agency is kind of embroiled there.
Okay, so maybe we can like just shift just a little bit. There's data in this paper, and I'm confused about it. And I was wondering if you could, I think this is kind of partially what you have referred to already, but what these data are showing or trying to express.
It's a synthesis, and a lot of like the author list is huge, right? And so a lot of the cases are things that authors or that like their labs have been involved in, that they're just like bringing kind of as like the material basis for what is like this larger like philosophy that they're developing.
Like rice grain, soybean, and I think pig tooth or something.
Yeah, pigs. They're also talking about pigs.
over time. time is on the x-axis, I think, right? What are they trying to express with this?
Yes, totally. So what they're doing is they're showing like different kind of the timeline of like the development or change of different traits that we associate with like domestication. So in the case of and I hope I'm getting this right, yes, like in the case of like rice and soy, there's this idea that that basically like grain size can be used to indicate that that's like the morphological change that we associate with like human domestication. That's like the point at which we go from like talking about like the wild progenitor of like what rice is now to talking about like rice. And what they're showing, just as like an example, yeah, so estimated rates of phenotypic change, right, is just that these, they're showing like the timeline of these changes that we say are indicative of domestication taking place. So like for like the rice grain thing, you can see like grain size over the course of, what is that, 6,000 years ago to 3,000 years ago, no, to like up to 2,000 years ago, wasn't, but it's not like a, like, there's not like a like snap.
Yeah, that's what I was wondering. Yeah, there's not a
domestication event. There's not like a moment at which like the thing becomes formed. What's actually happening is you have a record of thousands of years of this relationship with this plant where there's little tiny shifts happening. Grain size, grain size is changing for X number of reasons, again, over the course of thousands of years. And like in like accretionally, we end up with larger grains at some point, but like really accretionally and with like backing and forthing.
Yeah, this is what you were saying before, is like there's like there not being evidence necessarily of humans imposing some like really gross change.
Right, exactly. That what it seems to like, iterative is the best word that I can think of for these relationships, right? They're iterative. They're like that they're, whether they're grains that, you know, the different kinds of like plants that people have just been like eating and interested in for a long time, or animals that have like for whatever reason attached like their own behavior and ecology, like pigs also have like a long history with humans, that like that history is exactly like not necessarily like linear, like that we don't just have like the increase of like set traits, you know, like that then equal like the like ideal domesticated type. Pigs moving in and out of like human management through time, they're crazy. They'll like until I think even like now domesticated pigs can still like breed with wild boars. I don't know if that's totally true, but I think it is.
And it's a huge problem because the like when you have like farms full of like massive amounts of domesticated pigs and they're not like watched over because there's just too many of them, they can get out and breed with wild boars and then create like exploding wild boar populations.
So if one of our like lines for like what is a species is like it can't, you know, it can only like internally reproduce, that's, pigs don't follow that. Like we, you know what I mean? So either we call like wild boars and like our little like pink pigs like the same species, or we like rethink like the speciation concept, which is also like part and parcel of like rethinking like the domestication concept, right? So right there, the case studies that they're using, right, are different things associated with the change of like grains, just in part because grain crops became so important through time, and that does go back pretty far. Domestication of intensive use of seed plants, just about all regions, goes back thousands and thousands of years. That again, like these like markers are not markers of domestication, or like, you know, phenotypic expressions of the biological, of like the interchange of like people altering the animal or plant's environment, and then the animal and plant, you know, like changing through time in association with that environment. That it's right, it's all over the place.
I was kind of like wondering, like, what does it look like to do research?
Oh, totally. It is a really cool and like also like challenging, but yeah, generative part of the entire line of inquiry of like humans and environments. Is it just has to include everybody. Everybody has to become a little bit literate in, you know, everybody else's like subfields. And this is a big point for like things like open access, and also like accessible presentation of people's data and conclusions from other fields. My ability to like engage with any of this is just other people's really good syntheses of what is incredibly complex, you know, like evolutionary ecology.
I did love how interdisciplinary this is. Like, I loved the incorporation of philosophy with quantitative data, which I'm glad you asked about the graphs, Caitlin, because the graphs were befuddling to me as well. Yeah, this is wonderful. This is like a composite science, and it's not even just science. It's humanistic as well.
It is. It has, of course, its own pitfalls. Like I think it anytime like anything starts achieving like too rosy, we fall into really easy patterns of groupthink, as a collective, this entire world of looking at human environmental interactions has been really stuck on what we can say about systems that aren't just based on agriculture, like trying to like really conceptualize and like theorize other forms of economy. We've been, you know, kind of like stalled for probably like a couple generations on that one. Because exactly like the incorporation of different like forms of knowledge, including like indigenous, like traditional ecological knowledge, is also like a slow and ongoing process that's essential to this, right? Because like to assume that like our understanding of, by our understanding, like the like, you know, like the scientific understanding of biology is the only way by which to describe how organisms and people interact. We're missing, you know what I mean? We're missing an entire like rich world of how people have described this and continue to describe this in other cultures and other times. So that's another part that.
Yeah, I was gonna kind of like in the other direction on the time axis, like there was, I think especially toward the end, there's a bit about the application of these ideas to climate change and sustainability, maybe. Yeah, here. The shift of perspective, and I think by this shift, meaning in general, the idea of process and time, this shift of perspective is not simply an intellectual exercise, but fundamental to redirecting approaches to contemporary dilemmas surrounding food insecurity and sustainability. So I was wondering if you could talk about maybe what that is meant by that.
Yeah, that's another weakness of this as an area of research. So what happens at the end of just about every paper that's like a big synthesis of like, you know, rethinking domestication, rethinking human effects on landscapes through time, rethinking even like the idea that people are inherently destructive to environments. We know that they're not. There's always this point where they're like, and this should have implications for how we think about climate change and like food security, right? And it's like, it's that ultimate, like, it's the problems that are like, that are particular to like climate change and like issues of like distribution and like food security, like globally, aren't because people don't have like good information. It's because like there's power structures that like make them so. So I get a little frustrated with like the little like kind of like, this can be used to like fix climate change if we all just know that, you know, that in fact domestication wasn't just an event, but it's a process. It's like, no, like, yes, that's somehow part of it in like a really complicated, nuanced way, like understandings of the world, like ideology, like that's important, right? To like the decisions we make and like the structures we build, and etc. But that's not the thing. Like that's not like the silver bullet or whatever of the current moment. We're not. So like the relevance of this kind of thing to coming up with better configurations of relationships between society and environment into the future. It's not just like in having people like read this stuff, and it's also because the ways that it does get picked up, like this direct kind of knowledge, it's usually in kind of like niche and rarefied circles, right? Like yes, there have been really cool, like, you know, like communal living movements that have been based on a lot of these ideas. You know, there's like indigenous groups that continue to like use old traditions and also like reinvent traditions based off of this kind of information about like, you know, how we can think about different ways that people relate to the environment and plants and animals that aren't just, you know, determined by like kind of like the, you know, like Western or like capitalist or like extractive like mode of thinking. So I don't know where that puts it, because I think that's my own kind of like personal huge open question. And the open question that's like part of like the book I was talking about before that we're all really excited about, the David Graeber, David Wengrow, Dawn of Everything. Like this stuff is so exciting, and it's so exciting. It's just, it comes up with all kinds of, this is also something that happens like with like how like Marx has been used or anybody else, right? Like these ideas and ways of seeing the world, it's incredible. It can like literally change how you approach your daily life. You know what I mean? Like this is so cool. But how it gets mobilized politically, again, I'm not saying they're not connected. It's just, it's like, it's not, I don't understand all of the parts of articulation or how exactly this stuff becomes something that can actually shift power decisions, except for hopefully it just makes everybody like less authoritarian.
I mean, I think it fits into the kind of idea of like prefigurative politics, which is doing things that you want to see happen, because it fits into like, well, yes, we know that the big problem is that there are these power structures, and obviously like that needs to go. But in order to do that, we also need to know like what kinds of things are we building?
Yeah, what's next
instead? So like to me, that's where that fits in, that it's not the solution to the power structure, but it's the like necessary what comes next and how do we start doing that.
Like that ties into, so David Graeber's like a famously was like involved with like anarchist theory and like prefigurative politics, like that has like that's a kind of like tenet of anarchist thought as far as I understand it. But so like that is the idea, like that's almost like the point of, okay, so if part of right there, the argument that's again made in this book of everything is like that, like societies became like stuck and fixed somewhere in the process of the development and like expansion of capitalism, and like the way out is somehow like plugged into this knowledge of like how, you know, like people like organize themselves like 3,000 years ago in like Northern California, like how are these things linked? And their point is exactly like, just know that there's other possibilities that you can start building like now, like you can form organizations and like refuse to do things and etc. based on what you know, and you can encourage other people to do the same.
I'm so of two minds about this as well, Grace. Like I'm my work is explicitly political, and like I think most people's work should be, but at the same time I'm very aware that a lot of like that move at the end of the article, that is also hugely prevalent in literary studies as well. Like, oh, here's how this weird method can like bridge political partisanship in America. It's like, what? And it's like, and it's all like it's clearly mostly like it's at least 75% self-aggrandization, celebration of like your own field and stuff.
Right.
But on the other hand, like Jamie, back to Gramsci, maybe there is something to be said about like hegemony or like passive like having a counter hegemony, which is like not like the material battlefield of politics, but like the intellectual battlefield, and like this has to go into the air somehow, and then that will somehow through processes affect people's minds.
But yeah, no, so I'm left like I like, and also there's that entire thing of just like the extreme frustration of how politics get played out in academia, specifically when people like bring their attempt to make a political statement within their actual research itself. Like it's just, it almost like shows like the powerlessness of like this sector of society, but also it's a little bit frustrating because it like there's something a little bit cynical about it, I think. I would say not in all cases, but in a lot of them. Like, for example, like this group of, you know, fully like this group of adults knows also that like just like bringing this paper or ideas about domestication to the UN and being like, we need to finally institute, you know, like a global like redistribution tax or whatever, like that's not going to work. And they know that. And like, but like next level steps, like this is how these papers always end. It's not like, and so we've decided that we are, you know, forming a new collective where in every agricultural college in America, we, you know, will all like seat it and like, you know, teach classes about different ways of relating to animals. Like that's not what they're pitching. They could, that would be an action, right? And they never do that. And it's like, you guys know that this doesn't work, but you keep doing it.
I was going to ask you what, you know, like in every field there is, you know, like a paper will come out and we perceive it one way and I'll judge it or don't. And then there kind of ends up being these like almost factions, or not factions, but like just like schools of thought. How is this paper, people talk about a paper that is influential for good or for bad? Like how is this perceived, or what are the kind of counter?
Where is it like positioned in like the archaeology like discourse? Yeah, totally. So there is like an alive and well total counterpoint to this, like complete, which is which honestly in terms of like publication load and etc. is maybe the more predominant line of thought, which is considering all these processes through the principles of microeconomics. So things like human behavioral ecology and this idea that the way to understand how people have interacted with the environments in the past, that we can strip away all of these questions about process, historical contingency, et cetera, that we can just look at it in terms of individual actors making rational choices according to models of efficiency. Like that's how people will describe processes of domestication. And they can even do it in ways that mirror this kind of paper. They could take the same data set, you know, like the like example, like the pig graph or whatever, and there's ways by which people, because there's papers that do this, like engineer arguments to be like, this is because as individual, pseudo like property owning, it's always, this is one of those things, like, I guess I'm like, there's like the critique is like bigger, so I'm not making it explicit, but like one key issue with that like microeconomic approach of individual rational actors is it's not how societies have worked in the past. People have made decisions communally. The idea that we are individual economic and political actors that we have, that's like, part of like the ideology of capitalism, is just it does not fit with what the records we have of how most people have understood themselves as humans through time, and how societies operate in the past. So that's like the critique of it, and like the entire like kind of, you could describe this like really slow pig process by just imagining, like a million guys through time who are individually making the most efficient choice at the moment, and that somehow like stalls pig domestication, because for that individual at the time it wasn't worth raising the piglets or whatever. You can explain these same data sets using that line of argument, not as well, and it doesn't take into effect kind of like the net stories and kind of like net picture that we have of how social changes actually happen in the past. But so that's the counterpoint.
I immediately bristled when he said microeconomics, because I did not enjoy that class. But I do think it is really interesting to know what counterpoints exist in a field that's not yours, because it enriches like the way that my very kind of narrow understanding of this, and I can see it, like I can see how that argument kind of forms.
Yeah, it like makes more sense when you know the opposite or something. Like totally, it's the same. This whole thing, yeah, it makes more sense when you know what people are reacting against, like what kind of like the shadow argument is.
Mark, do you have other questions?
I have one that's I was actually the first one I was going to ask, because it's so like just like foundation building, and it's almost just like a para textual question. But this is a ton of authors for me. It's Bogard et al, but like really it's mostly the et al. I mean,
it's a lot of it all.
So a lot of it all. And I come from a field where one is the normal author. So I guess my question was like, how does labor in anthropology get, like, how does intellectual like labor get done? Are these graduate students? Why did this paper take like a dozen people?
It's like a deceptively easy answer in this case. So that doesn't really like, it's not that revealing about kind of like the overall like procedure of anthropology. But so this is the result of a big conference. This was the School of Advanced Research in Santa Fe hosted a couple years ago, a big like let's get together and talk about domestication conference. And this was the group. So these are mostly like senior practitioners of archaeology. There's two people on here who are at WashU and are actually like people within anthropology. One of them is one of my co-advisors. Another one's a very senior member of our department. So Fiona Marshall and Natalie Mueller. Fiona Marshall works on domestication, like animal relationships in Africa, has been her main research world. And then Natalie Mueller works on relationships between people and plants in Eastern North America, and takes this really kind of interesting, like evolutionary biology, like experimental approach. Basically, she does a lot of things, but like she grows gardens of these plants that used to be domesticated in Eastern North America, but have like fallen out of domestication. She's found like seeds of like the wild relatives, and is attempting like all these experiments to try to like mirror what people might have been doing in the past with these plants that like led to their domestication. So she's kind of like recreating an agricultural system.
So did each person like write a paragraph?
Knowing the people I know on it, like this is somebody else's like intellectual project. Like this is like, I got to imagine. So yeah, Amy Bogard, I think, is at like Oxford, and I believe is pretty senior. So I don't know, but I would take it to be like that this is kind of the framing of everybody else's data and thoughts from this conference, but within like this framework that is kind of like the framework of like the first author.
I kind of wanted to end on one thing either that you took away from this reading and discussion, and or something that you're interested in seeing in this field in the future. I guess I can start with, I'm interested in seeing this kind of like line of thinking applied to things like AI and computers.
I'm interested in just like philosophy of science being like baseline integrated into people's research all the time, which is the ways that can happen more. Something I want to see more of. And I think it's the thing that's always that was interesting to me in this conversation. And
yeah, that's exactly kind of what I always value, the like addition of dimensionality to like my work. And I think that there are like a lot of ways that this can happen. So it's not like my work and then I have, you know, another field enter my work. It's like there are multiple ways that this itself could not necessarily enter my specific work, but like because this is super dimensional, I'm interested to see how that's applied or could be applied. And I don't, honestly, part of me doesn't know how to access that, like how I'm not in this field, you know, so like my curiosity of how it comes around, maybe just trust that I will encounter.
What I'm taking away from it is that underneath a lot of the scientific findings and the scholarly language is quite a bit of hope in this article. Like what you say, Grace, like these narratives of history that few people question unless they're given the chance to can be unsettled, and we don't have to live a life thinking that all of history is contingent upon private property, that maybe it's not so.
That's a great one to end on. So thank you all for joining me for the 7th episode of In Plain English. Yeah, thanks for giving a lot of time and thought and great discussion to this.
Thanks for having us.
yeah, thank you all. That was awesome. Thanks, Jamie.
Thank you all for tuning in to the 7th episode of In Plain English. Once again, we've been discussing the paper Reconsidering Domestication from a Process Archaeology Perspective by Amy Bogard and many other fantastic contributors. As always, you can follow us on Facebook and Twitter and now Instagram at Plain English Sci. That's PlainEnglishSci. You can find our website at inplainenglishpod.org, where we always upload the papers so that you can read them and follow along with the episode. On our website, you can also find the Where to Listen tab, where you can find links to our podcast on all major podcast platforms. We upload our podcasts the first Tuesday of every month, so make sure that you subscribe on your favorite platforms so that you never miss an episode. Thanks again, and we'll see you next month for another episode of In Plain English.